Assalamu alaikum everyone. Today we're going to talk about Islam and Christianity and the Lord of the Rings, and this will be sort of an introduction, but it will also be in depth as well about the world of Middle Earth and how it ties to Abrahamic faiths, particularly in Islam, but we'll also be talking about Christianity as well. So here's a bio about Tolkien. He was a devout Catholic and created his world of Middle Earth as a child. And the first works of Middle Earth actually came out from his passion for linguistics. And as a child, he used to make up languages and figured that these languages actually needed to have a world and characters, which I find really cool because a lot of other authors, they usually start with the story first and then the language, but he's kind of the opposite. And the world he created was actually inspired by Norse and Finnish and Celtic mythology, and he also wanted Middle Earth to be an origin story or mythos for his own people, aka the English, because Tolkien was from the UK, and he took a lot of inspirations from for when he was writing, including his time spent in World War One and World War Two, and his own Christian faith. So let's start off with the cast of characters. Eru Iluvatar is known as the One or the All-Father, and he has his direct creation, and we'll go through some of these, which are the major creations, which is the Ainur or Vala, and they have different personalities and some aspect of free will, but exist to carry out the will of Eru, which is God. And the minor angels, which are called the Maya, spirits or wizards who have specialized tasks. Gandalf, Saruman, and Sauron also belong in this group. We also have the fallen angel archetype or character called Melkor and Morgoth. These are the same person. And we also have goblins, orcs, and urukai, which is the bigger version of orcs, and they're made actually from Morgoth, and they're seen as kind of corrupted elves. We also have the elves themselves, immortal beings, though they can actually be killed. They are kind of blessed with long life, and they have a long cultural history and memory, and thus they are the ones to talk about the key events in Middle Earth the most, and they are also the ones who talk about Eru the most. They have a limited heaven also called Valinor, and it's kind of within the material universe of Middle Earth. And characters who are elves, they include people like Galadriel and Legolas, but there are a lot of others. The second one is dwarves. They reside in the mountains, and they're known for blacksmithing, mining, and their love for treasures. And this is particularly seen in kind of the Hobbit books. But people like them are Gimli, Thorin, Balin. And the third one is men, and they're known to be mortal beings with a shorter lifespan than the rest. And they have the gift of man, which is death. And their afterlife is actually partly unknown because but they do return to Eru and the halls of Mandos. Though men don't really remember Eru as much as the elves, because they are seen as a newer creation. And examples of men are Aragorn, Boromir, Faramir, Eowyn, King Theoden, and half-elven, which is kind of like a mix between elves and men, mostly like a mortal man and a female elf. And people these are Beren and Luthien and Aragorn and Arwen. They are given the choice of race, and thus being given the choice of being mortal or immortal. For example, Elrond and his brother turned human, and he kind of stayed as an elf. Hobbits, these are related to men, but they are smaller in stature, I think even more than the dwarves, and they are mortal like the men. And people like the Hobbits are Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin. They are quite secretive until the Lord of the Rings come into place. So let's start with the origin story of Middle Earth, the creation of Ada or Ea. The universe was like sung into existence by the Ainur in the command of Eru, and with the phrase Ea, which means it is, and Eru and the Ainur kind of like speak the universe into being. Thus, Ea is the original phrase for and the name Ada, which actually means the earth, the void, and other like distinct parts of the skies and the heavens. And the music defined the changes and the events that will occur on Ada following the impending birth. Melkor, whose name later becomes Morgoth, was actually one of these Ainur, which is like the major angels, and the source of all evil in the Middle Earth and Ada as a whole. Melkor disrupted the harmony of the primary musical theme by introducing his own discord. And in this case, Eru actually quickly stopped the music and just manifested all of Ea straight away after that because of his disruption. And the angels are like in awe in the beginning at the creation of Ada, and as a result, Eru kind of gives them the choice whether to stay with him or to go to Ada, and Morgoth actually chose to go to Ada, which is Middle Earth. So the similarities between like the religions is, I found like very, very how do I say it, very kind of distinct, because in Islam the Quran actually mentions his command is only when he intends a thing that he says to it be, and it is. This is kind of like almost word for word what Eru Iluvita says, because Eru says it is, and yeah, in the Quran it says be, and it is. And when Eru created Ada, he used the word Ea. And in Christianity, the fallen angel is actually like Satan in this case, and is very much similar to the fall of Melkor. And because he was seen as an angel before, like a Maya, but then he's still considered a Maya, but he kind of fell down to earth as well, so he's kind of like a fallen angel archetype. And when Satan was cast out of heaven due to his arrogance, and it's very similar to Melkor. And people actually forget that it is kind of within God's plan that he would be cast out of heaven, basically. And it's the same in Middle Earth as well. Eru knows about Melkor's mischief, and it's all part of his plan. So who is Melkor and Morgoth? And let's just talk about that. Before the creation of man, Melkor was like creating mischief, as we said before, and Melkor says to the elves to be aware of the men, and kind of did like whispering to them that the men are actually a better creation of Eru. And the elves actually get a bit weary, but they know Melkor is an enemy because they are kind of an earlier creation and they know about Eru more, so they are a bit wary of him. And many of the elves actually perform like a pilgrimage, or hijra in Islam, a journey to Valinor, which is elvish heaven. And yeah, the men actually wake up with the sun after this, and but the elves actually already have awoken before the sun. And Melkor actually manages to find the men before the elves, and which in turn actually results in some men turning to worship Melkor. And around this time, Melkor is actually renamed to Morgoth, and the war between the elves and Morgoth actually begins, where Morgoth kills Fingolfin, one of the greatest elf shaheeds or martyrs. Though like through this war, Morgoth's spirit or Melkor's spirit was actually cast out. So in that time, the big devil, the big Satan, is gone. And this is when Melkor's kind of second-hand man, which is Sauron, he enters, and Morgoth's assistant, who is actually also a Maya. And Sauron teaches the elves how to like make the rings, and tells them that the men can actually achieve immortality with the help of the rings. So he gives him 9 rings, and 3 to the elves and 7 to the dwarfs. And they were all actually deceived, because he kind of secretly like made another ring which overpowered them all. And this is like the one ring which Sauron owned, and his entire life is like tied to the ring. So this kind of brings us to the here and now, which is like Lord of Lord of the Rings. And this is kind of like a summary of what the book is. In a tranquil Shire settlement, young Frodo Baggins, is burdened with a monumental task when his elderly cousin Bilbo entrusts the ring to him. Frodo must leave his home and embark on a treacherous journey across Middle-earth to the cracks of doom in order to destroy the ring and prevent the Dark Lord from carrying his terrible plan. So this is where we begin, where the ring is actually found, and Frodo is kind of like given the ring, kind of, but we'll discuss that more. So the first topic that I want to discuss is the desires or nafs in Islam, and how the ring is almost analogous to the desires. The primary goal and battle of the story of Lord of the Rings is how Frodo must cast the ring into the fire, but it's also a story of how many people give in to the ring. So before Sauron loses his ring, actually during when Sauron loses his ring, the ring was actually like cut off from Sauron's hand, and during like this war, and the king, one of the kings of the men, kind of gets the ring, and he kind of takes it from himself, and he becomes like brainwashed and everything, and the ring kind of keeps on getting passed down. So eventually, like, Frodo finds the ring. That's kind of like a very rough summary, but like it includes like the people who are like the 9 Nazgul, who literally turned into ghost-like beings, forever hunting the ring because they were completely brainwashed by the ring, and Sauron, who actually brainwashed entire kingdoms of men. And people like Boromir, the elder son of the steward of Gondor, though he later became a martyr as well. But it also like goes through how hard it is to cast away the ring, or your inner desire. So if you literally just look at the ring, you immediately become encapsulated by it. That's how tough it is to give it up. And despite like being the main character of the story, Frodo says, "It is my burden and no one else can bear it. It is too late now, Sam. You can help me in that. You can't help me in that way again. I am almost in its power now. I could not give it up, and if you tried to take it, I should go mad." This shows how you are literally the only person who knows about your personal desires, and no one can help you or comfort you. Well, they can comfort you, but to an extent, and they can only be with you to an extent, but they can't take your burdens away. And it also shows how how it's tied to Satan as well, and in this case it's tied to Sauron. So if the story went awry and we saw Sauron's victory, we should see this as like letting Satan take hold of us, and as if you can see Sauron himself as a personification of Satan. The period in which like Lord of the Rings is based, though, is actually a time where Sauron and his master Morgoth is actually locked away. So similarly, in Ramadan, which is almost coming up, Satan is actually locked away, and we can't really blame Sauron for our wrongdoings because he's not really there. Though you can hear or you can feel his whispers, actually, maybe, and the whispers can be heard because you're so used to it. And when interacting with the ring, it's a similar case, because the ring actually itself whispers to you and like discusses your desires and stuff like that. So it's only between the ring, which is the nafs, and yourself. And Tolkien actually says that in The Lord of the Rings, the conflict is not about freedom, though that is naturally involved. It is about God and his sole right to divine honor. The Eldar and the Númenóreans believed in the one, the true God, and held worship of any other person an abomination. Sauron desired to be God King and was held to be this by his servants. Sauron was not a sincere atheist, but he did preach atheism because it weakened the resistance to himself, and he had ceased to fear God's action in order. Sauron here is actually basically fighting for the path of shirk, which is like making partners with God, and he can also like be seen as the Dajjal as well, just like putting it in there because of his one eye and the role he plays in the deception of man in the end of times. I actually found like this to be very true as well, like Sauron and the perished nations. So in Islam we have the concept of so many nations which are like perished, and it's very similar to the Middle Earth as well, because many men actually became jealous of the elves as they were gifted with immortal life. So Sauron, actually knowing this, gave the waswasa or whispers and told Ar-Pharazôn, for example, the last king of Númenor, to break the ban of the Valar, which is basically to enter the deathless lands, which only is reserved for elves. And he invites them to shirk as well and gets them to worship Morgoth instead, which is crazy. The men of Númenor were actually blessed with long life compared to other men, so it kind of shows how ungrateful they are as well. And he also creates the ring and seduces the 9 men who turned into Nazgul, as we said. Sauron and Morgoth had a hand also in creating life. The corrupted orcs at the time trying to basically play God. And this actually led only to destruction. Númenor, Minas Ithil, which is called Tower of the Moon, which later became Minas Morgul, Tower of Sorcery, which I find a bit funny. And the fall of Gondolin. This actually shows that giving into your nafs only means destruction and death. And because they were like perished soon after this. And Islam and Christianity, we have a lot of stories similar too, because, for example, the people of Noah, Lot, Ad, Thamud, Fir'aun, which is the Pharaoh, these are all people who gave into their desires, ran havoc and chaos in the world, and had a particular type of arrogance which actually only led to the entire nation being destroyed. We can see in the character of Gollum the polarity and the struggle of nafs as well, or the desires, and this is like a case study of him. And Gollum is like, I think, one of the most interesting characters of the Lord of the Rings, because he shows kind of 2 sides of the nafs. And in Islam, there are kind of 3 types or three stages of nafs. The first one is nafsul ammara, which is letting your desires rule over you. The second is nafsul lawama, which is sinning but also feeling blame and guilty and conscious of it. The third is nafsul mutma'inna, which is freeing yourself from worldly pleasures, which Gollum actually sadly doesn't end up doing this. And the story of him is like, he kind of has an internal dialogue with the nafs, but imagine doing it like out loud and saying it out loud. So first he goes through like a completely evil self who is kind of addicted to the ring or to the nafs. And later, because Frodo kind of makes him see, like, shows him mercy and begins to like empathize with him because he too had the ring, he kind of begins to go into nafsul lawama, where he's conscious of the sinning, but he doesn't want to do it anymore because he'd seen the kindness of Frodo. But eventually, a long story short, Frodo kind of betrays him, but not really betrays him, but Gollum thinks that, and he falls back into the first nafsul ammara, which is letting your desires rule over you, because he sees that, like, he wasn't really authentically nice to him, I guess, and he kind of just lets the ring take over him again. And it's interesting because it kind of shows us that we shouldn't really rely on the world or the dunya to, or people, in fact, to basically control our nafs in that way. You should only have like faith in God and rely upon Him, because if you rely upon other people or or worldly things, the chances are it can either be for good or for bad, and you'd never know like which way it will go, and you don't really want to be dependent on that for your own well-being. The next part is like arrogance and pride of Saruman, which is another case study. Saruman is like a character who is actually very wise in The Hobbit, and he's kind of on the side of Gandalf and everyone else who is like good. And he's, yeah, like I mentioned, a Maya and Istari, which is wizard, similar to Gandalf. However, unlike Gandalf, during the Battle of Sauron, which takes place in The Lord of the Rings, Saruman actually sides with Sauron and is actually later killed in the end as a result. This shows that despite being old and having knowledge, you can actually still fall for deceptions of your desires, and of course Satan as well. Similar parallels actually kind of derive in the Quran as well. For example, the story of Korah or Karun. I think it's in the Bible as well, but yeah. In the Quran it says, Korah slash Karun replied, I have been granted all this because of some knowledge I have. Did he not know that Allah had already destroyed some of the generations before him who were far superior to him in power, greater in accumulating wealth? There will be no need for the wicked to be asked about their sins. So this shows that Korah or Karun was kind of boasting that all his knowledge and all his wealth is due to himself only, and it's not a gift from God or anyone else. And that kind of shows like a sense of arrogance. But then later in the story, he kind of gets destroyed as a result, similar to Sauron. Saruman, and it also like suggests that we should be lifelong learners. No one is ever too powerful or too knowledgeable to have a mentor. And in the Quran, Musa, peace be upon him, also has like Khidr and his brother Harun or Aaron in the story to help him, even though he was a prophet. So yeah. Next up, we have Boromir and the concept of Nafsul Lawama. And Boromir actually is my favorite character in Lord of the Rings because he's very, very human, and we can all relate to him in some aspect. And yeah, like he becomes actually captivated by the ring and gives in to his desires, and actually tries to take the ring from Frodo at one point. Although he gave in to his desires, he did it from a place of love for his people and his city, because they were like heavily being attacked by the orcs and Sauron's army, and he thought that having the ring would actually be beneficial for him and actually be used to win against Sauron and his army. But what we learn is that giving into your nafs for whatever reason has an element of evilness to it, because it's kind of wholly corrupting. It actually twists and corrupts the good, as the ring itself is purely evil. Boromir, despite having good reasons to take the ring, takes it, but later falls for the ring himself, and he kind of ends up tearing away at Frodo to get it. And the nafs in this case actually leads to death for Boromir and destruction. But was it actually really the end? No, actually, because Tolkien kind of makes him have a last redemption arc. Despite almost taking the ring from Frodo escapes with the ring, while kind of an army of orcs arrives, and Boromir kind of awakens from the daze of the ring, and eventually like gives his own life to save the lives of two hobbits, Merry and Pippin. At this point, he shows Nafsul Lawama, heavy guilt, to Aragorn during his death, and actually becomes the first Shaheed in the Lord of the Rings story. So what we learn here is that despite giving into the ring, and despite becoming totally encapsulated by the ring at some point. You have always like a chance to redeem yourself, and it's not really the end. You don't have to stay in that state forever, and you can actually mend yourself, because failure is kind of just like teaches you. And yeah, similar to that, Frodo actually rejecting the Paragon despite being the main character. And it shows Frodo and Boromir's very similar story, because both of them, despite, I mean, Frodo has been carrying the ring for like years and years at this point. So, not really years and years, but like, you know what I mean? A lot longer than most characters, but despite that, you'd expect him to actually win in the end, because he is the main character, and we all love a good, happy story where the main character casts their desires into the fire, but that actually doesn't happen, and Tolkien doesn't do that. At the end of The Return of the King, the third book slash movie, Frodo can't cast the ring into the fire, and actually completely gives into the ring and takes it for himself, similar to what Boromir did or tried to do. And he actually gives in to his deepest and darkest desires in himself. But we wonder why Tolkien actually wrote it this way, because it's very rare that the main character is considered morally wrong at the end. Either like they fail but they give their life and they have a good sacrifice, or they win in the end and overcome everything. But in this one, he fails twice. He fails in the ring, and he fails in like giving the sacrifice as well. And I think Tolkien actually does this because he kind of wants to make because the hobbits and men in general, like Frodo's a hobbit, are meant to be like human, and we're meant to be fallible. And he actually like kept the ring for a lot longer than anyone else, as I said. But throughout the story, he kind of did show a lot of control. But when you struggle for like an entire lifetime, it becomes like harder and harder to let go. And Tolkien actually says it is possible for the good, even the saintly, to be subjected to a power of evil which is too great for them to overcome in themselves. And Tolkien actually goes deeper and says that Frodo's failure was not a moral failure, despite stereotypically what we think, and due to the event being too great for any person to truly overcome. And this actually, I think, comes from his Christian faith, because in the Catechism of the Catholic Church it says, original sin does not have the character of personal fault in any of Adam's descendants. It is a deprivation of original holiness and justice, and human nature has not been totally corrupted. It is wounded in the natural powers proper to it, subject to ignorance, suffering, and the dominion of death, and inclined to sin. It is also partly influenced by his time spent in World War I, where he saw his own friends of his die. And Tolkien believes also like in moral limits, where there are some things which are impossible for a person to be moral, and it's just like beyond our limits. And what Tolkien actually cares about is striving to reach our moral limit, and the struggle of reaching it is moral. And that struggle is actually very hard, and whoever like fails, the actual failure is due to not striving towards that moral limit and falling short of trying to reach it, I guess. But in Islam, it's kind of different, because we believe like in no soul shall carry a burden they can not bear. And but we do have the concept of actually acknowledging our humanness, and we call this kind of struggle and the battle of the nafs the greater jihad, the struggle to defeat our inner personal desires, and is seen as a greater enemy than jihad on the battlefield. And that as humans, like we are fallible creatures, and this is why like repentance is such a big thing in Islam as well, because it kind of eradicates the fact that like how we fail and everything. So it kind of falls on to our next topic, which is mercy. Like why mercy matters in The Lord of the Rings. I think mercy is plays in such an important role, probably the most important role in The Lord of the Rings, though it's very, very not on the nose. Let's just say that. And yeah, so when Frodo returns to his friends after the ring's destructions, Legolas and Aragorn don't blame Frodo when they learn about how Frodo gives into the ring, and they understand how the journey was and how difficult the reality was of the struggle. So, however, Tolkien reaches further than this and addresses the notion of how moral limits is surpassed through a more powerful force in the grace of God. So in Christianity, as St. Paul affirms, where sin increased, grace abounded all the more. But to do its work, grace must uncover sin, so as to convert our hearts and bestow on us righteousness to eternal life through Jesus Christ our Lord. Like a physician who probes the wound before treating it, God by his word and by his spirit casts a living light on sin. So this kind of shows like sin can be increased and increased, but through that, God's grace and God's mercy is shown all the more by the end. And Frodo actually here gives in to the nafs in the final moment of truth, but Eru Iluvatar, the one true God, invites him to the Grey Havens, a port city which actually leads to Valinor, which is the Elvish heaven, and he kind of invites him into the Grey Havens, even though even though it's kind of like only for elves mostly, but because in Valinor he is kind of treated with like, how do I say it? He is kind of like he has the ability to do away with the trauma most, compared to being in like the real world, I guess, which is much more humane. And Tolkien suggests that not only is a man destined to sin, but through his story he portrays God's grace and mercy, not through doing good deeds, but how it's freely given. This is a very Christian idea, but it's also a very Muslim idea as well. So in Islam, Abu Dhar reported, the Messenger of Allah, peace and blessings be upon him, said, Allah the Almighty says, whoever comes with a good deed will have the respect of 10 like it and even more. Whoever comes with an evil deed will be recompensed for one evil deed like it, or he will be forgiven. Whoever draws close to me by the length of a hand, I will draw close to him by the length of an arm. Whoever draws close to me by the length of an arm, I will draw close to him by the length of a fathom. Whoever comes to me walking, I will come to him running. Whoever meets me with enough sins to fill the earth, not associating any partners with me, I will meet him with as much forgiveness. Aisha, may Allah be pleased with her, reported also that the Messenger, peace be upon him, said, observe moderation in good deeds, and if you fail to observe it perfectly, try to do as much as you can do to live up to this ideal of moderation and be happy, for none would be able to get into paradise because of his deeds alone. They, the companions of the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, Allah's Messenger, not even you. Thereupon he said, not even I, but that Allah wraps me in his mercy, and bear this in mind, that the deed loved by most by Allah is the one which is done constantly, even though it is small. Tolkien's work isn't really about fantastical battles, and the story isn't really changed by them either. The Battle of the Black Gate, for example, was literally a distraction, and it was actually thought of by Aragorn so that Sauron's eye wouldn't land on Frodo and Sam trying to destroy the ring. The real battle is actually taking place in Mount Doom and in Frodo's heart. The most important battles were the ones done in quiet. If Frodo hadn't shown mercy to Gollum, Gollum wouldn't ever have landed in Mount Doom with Frodo and wouldn't have had a hand in getting rid of the ring. Bilbo also showed Gollum mercy in The Hobbit much earlier than Frodo, and both had multiple chances of killing Gollum, but they chose not to because they pitied and felt sorry for him. These events wouldn't be written into the greater Middle-earth tale, even though sparing the life of Gollum is probably the most important act in destroying the One Ring, because if Frodo would have killed Gollum, Gollum wouldn't have been there to wrestle with Frodo in the Mount Doom, and the ring would never have been thrown into the fire as a result. So it shows that showing mercy matters, and it should be freely given, and how it's good to show mercy even though no one is watching, and that it could be the turn of the tide later on in life or the afterlife. Aragorn actually says deeds will not be less valiant because they are unpraised, which I think kind of wraps this thing up pretty nicely. So finally, after coming back home, Frodo also suffers from PTSD and continues to fear for the rest of his days in Middle-earth, and nothing really could heal him, which is why Frodo had to literally go to the Grey Havens, Valinor or Elvish Heaven, to find peace for the rest of his life. I touched on this point before, but this is kind of a better explanation. And Tolkien shows that the pains of the war and the effects of the war don't really vanish just because you won them. And Frodo says himself, there is no real going back. Though I may come to the Shire, it will not be the same. It will not seem the same, for I shall not be the same. I am wounded with a knife, sting, and tooth, and a long burden. Where shall I find rest? And even I think Arwen actually gives him her own necklace, which is kind of for healing, and that didn't even work. He used to have lots of nightmares and cry on the night, from what I remember as well. So he really did struggle after getting the ring, and it shows like how hard, I mean after destroying the ring, but yeah, it shows how hard the struggle can be, since like it's a lifelong one. And the struggle of Middle-earth, this is the struggle of Middle-earth, but it's also the struggle that befalls on all of us as well, as we said. And Galadriel finally says that he has dwelt in the West since the days of the dawn, and I have dwelt with him years uncounted, and together through the ages of the world we have fought the long defeat. And the long defeat here actually can suggest our final nafs, which is the final stage of the nafs, which is nafsul mutma'inna, freeing yourself from worldly pleasures, because it can also mean fighting and doing good deeds, even though everything will come to an end, because in reality everything will come to an end. Everyone will die someday, and it's a noble battle, but it's actually an impossible battle, because no one really can surpass death, and it's impossible to win, because we all have a limited time here on Earth. And Tolkien actually calls this the true theory of nobility and heroism. So this is kind of like this topic actually covered the main theme of the Lord of the Rings, I think, which is like the desires and the power of the desires in comparison, like with Islam and a bit of Christianity as well. I am planning to do these in some more in the future, so stay tuned. Part 2, and the topics I'm planning to include is more like maybe like practical ones which we see in the everyday world, and like marginalized communities, martyrdom, which we touched on a bit, and also death and the concept of death in Lord of the Rings and in religion as well, and also a very underrated topic, environmentalism. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and see ya.